Hi everyone, welcome. Well, today it seemed like a nice day to start off a new worm bin. So I've got my box over here full of bedding and moisture and grit and food. It's not even so new because it was 10 days ago that I set this thing up in preparation for launching it off with some worms that I've already got in the process of migrating out of their old environment to be hauled out today. I've also got my labels all set to go so that once this system is populated with worms, we can christen it with the label, just like you see all over there. All my systems have labels on them, but you'll notice that there is one box that just happens to have no label on it. That's the box in which the migration of the worms is occurring. The worms are actually the worms that used to live in my outdoor worm bag, version 6.0. And since the outdoor worm bag had no label, well, once the contents of that bag were placed in here to facilitate migration, I didn't bother creating a label for it. I knew which system this is. It's the worms from the outdoor worm bag. It was 13 days ago that this migration was initiated. I did come back over here on 3 occasions to aerate the material to try to promote drying, hopefully further motivating the worms to move out and to congregate over on this edge where we set up a horizontal migration feeding zone. And I do believe that today, I hope we're ready. I think we're going to be ready to initiate the haul out of the worms. We'll get a chance to inspect the castings to see if there's any stragglers. If there are, we can set up a bait box, try to round them after the fact. But today we're going to get these little guys into their new homes. So I'm going to get a glove on, get this system up on the bench, get the haul out started so we can launch off a new system. Let's get started. When I do haul outs, I find that this box is typically adequate to handle the contents of a horizontal migration feeding zone. So I assume that we'll be able to get the entire feeding zone out of there in one felt swoop. Now, if you were with me 13 days ago when we started this process, when we emptied the bag and we set up the migration feeding zone, the vermicompost was left uncovered. And the whole idea behind that was to promote drying, meant to be mainly a motivator to get the worms to exit on their own voluntarily. So I do always tend to think that getting the worms to congregate in the horizontal migration feeding zones is a combination of luring them with a tempting space to want to occupy and be in and stay in, and that's the feeding zone itself. But I also believe in motivating them to exit by creating a somewhat less favorable condition in their existing material to motivate them to leave. So it's sort of a push-pull dual effort to get these things going efficiently. And over the 3 occasions when I did come in here to aerate, I did find that on each occasion I was finding fewer and fewer worms occupying this stuff. Because, the stuff that was out on the surface was not this moist and comfortable as it is now with the plastic covers on it. The material on the surface would get quite dry, kind of like what you see on the perimeter over here where there was no plastic covering. And every time I would come in here to aerate and till up the material, I'd be blending in all that somewhat dry stuff, further reducing the average moisture content of the material. And it did seem to me like after the 3rd aeration it was no longer necessary to keep promoting drying in here. It just seemed to me like I'm going to let it be at this point until such a time that we finally come in here like we're doing today to do the haul out. On each occasion when I would come in here, I would also take the time while I was plowing through the material and checking it out to remove these larger fragments like I'm doing now, but I don't think it's all that important. You might have noticed me snagging a couple worms that I grabbed right when we first started tilling up the material, so that in itself might already be evidence to show us that there might still be enough of a worm population remaining in this material to warrant the setup of a baiting box or a bait station to help get the worms out of here. Because like here too, we've already got worm number 3 that I found, and I just noticed right next to that worm was the larva of a black soldier fly. And I guess that's one of the things that happens if you're bringing stuff in from outside, is you might bring things other than your worms in. And the black soldier fly larva, I kind of have an affinity for these little guys. So when I find one, whether it's a larva like this thing here, or sometimes I even on occasion have one of these things go full term, and then I find a little black soldier fly hanging out in one of my systems, I always take them outside, and I'll do the same with this little guy right here. And hopefully, at some point in the future, it'll be able to finish its transformation into a grown-up black soldier fly. So, let's get on with the fun here. I do keep bumping into worms, so I think I've already seen enough to warrant a a setup of a bait box. So I don't think we have to worry too much about leaving straggler worms behind. We'll take care of getting them rounded up too over the coming days and weeks. But right now, the focus of today's check-in is the relocation of the worms that did actually gather in here over the past 13 days to partake in the lovely feast that we left for them in the migration zone. So we can already see a good many of them hanging out right there on the edge. You can also see some of the other critters. Besides worms and besides black soldier flies, we could see pill bugs or isopods in here. Those little guys do a real number on tougher foods. They just shred stuff that might take the worms a significant amount of time to break down. So having them as helpers in your worm bins is definitely a plus, and definitely worth having if it's possible. I mean, if you go on your yard and you're able to round up a few, or you just happen to have them in your system already, don't treat them as a bad thing. Definitely keep them around and let them work to your benefit in your worm bin as helpers to your primary composting population, which is the worms. So, like I said earlier, we don't need to go crazy fishing out every last one, but I just can't seem to resist picking them up when I spot them. But yeah, I think the time has come to really get the haul out completed. As far as setting up the bait box in here, it's something I've got a few examples of shown on my channel, so I'll probably not even bother showing that. We'll simply get the haul out completed and get this out of the way so we can move on to the launch of the new system. And then at some point later, I'll set up a bait box and get the roundup of the stragglers underway as well. Now, this nice piece of cardboard here, loaded with a bunch of worms, will most certainly accompany the worms into their new home. But let's see if we can get some of them off the cardboard over here, just so that when it comes time to drop these little guys into their new home, we have just that much more eye candy to enjoy and watch the worms settle into their new home. But I'm going to take this piece of cardboard and we'll keep it with their new system so that it remains as part of their new home. It'll just get utilized as bedding in the near future. But for now, the focus of what we're doing is going to be the horizontal migration feeding zone. So let's get to the business of hauling these out. Hauling these little guys out so we can get them into their new home. So I'm just going to level off some material here And what we could do is we could bring back one of these pieces of bubble wrap onto which we can position our transport container. And it's at this point that we'll finally start to get a glimpse into how many worms have gathered over here in the horizontal migration feeding zone. And when we finally launch the new system, we'll also get a chance to see how many worms we've got. And as I usually do, I'll be turning to you guys, the viewers, to provide me with your estimate as to how many worms you believe we started today's new system with. What I do with everyone's estimates is that I average the numbers so that my estimate gets combined with everyone else's, and then the estimated worm count for the system ends up being that averaged number, which I think is kind of interesting. That's how I end up with these funny numbers, unusual, oddball numbers that don't seem to make much sense if you look at it without any context or any knowledge of how the number was arrived at. But the reason my worm bin estimated population numbers are usually some sort of a strange number, not some sort of just a round, large number, it's because it's an average of many people's estimates. So let's see what we can do about scooping out these last few bits of worms over here on the edge. Once again, done in a way that I try to let you guys see how many worms have come together. And if we missed some, that's a-okay as well, because the bait box will be there to help round them up. And I see a little roly-poly who is not very easy to show off because they have this tendency to roll up into a ball. That's why they're called roly-poly, I assume, because they roll once they get into that defensive position of rolling up into a sphere. So I didn't think I would want to leave that little guy behind. And as far as leaving little guys behind, I have yet another black soldier fly larva to include with the other two we located earlier. And I also believe I spotted another one right over here. I've not seen any flies, any black soldier flies that is, in my wormery. So I don't think it's been warm enough down here to enable them to transform to that next stage. It's interesting how they're able to remain in that larval form for such a long time, months, who knows how long, maybe even longer, until the conditions become opportune for them to get into the adult form, at which point they mate and then they drop dead. So I think we're pretty much at the point where we can set this box aside. And like I said, what's going to happen with this is I'll put it back up on the shelf and set up a bait box, which I usually just position right out here in the middle, which will be loaded with some nice bedding and food so that the worms, as they start to feel how the material that they're inhabiting is getting drier and drier and less comfortable to remain in, they'll have a place to retreat to. And then at some point in the near future, when it seems like the material has in fact become completely depopulated, we'll have a little family reunion. But I think it's time to get these guys into their new home. So let's get that started now. I'm usually not too good at spotting worm cocoons, but as I was getting ready to pick up the box of vermicompost that I just set aside, I thought I spotted what appeared to be a worm cocoon. So I figured let's bring that over here as well. And I think the time has come to get this started. But you know, before we do, really quick, let me just share with you some stats that I forgot to share earlier, just some information about the system. The system was launched 313 days ago, and even then we had a fairly small population that we thought to go in to the outdoor worm bag version 6.0 on day of launch. We think we had 673 worms. That's kind of what I meant as an example of weird numbers. Usually most people would put like a 0 or a 5 or some sort of a round number over there, coming up with estimated worm counts. And those are the sort of numbers I get from everyone, but once you average it, you come up with these oddball numbers. So other things to be mentioned about the system is the phases through which the system went. 174 days outside of everyday composting and 126 days spent foraging. And I do that as fed foraging, so just no new bedding, that's all that meant. And then at the end, those 13 days of migration. And what else was in here? This new system right here was built 10 days ago. 5 days ago we threw some castings in here to inoculate. And even over here, the vermicompost that I just set aside was the product of 25 feedings. And well, the 26th feeding technically is what I consider to still be in here if there's any leftovers after 13 days. So if you really wanted to equate what all that vermicompost is the result of, then I would probably tend to consider that as 25, not 26. And not that anyone cares, you know, that's just one of those quirky little things that I like to keep track of for whatever reason. So let's get this going. Let's get these little guys situated in their new home. Don't forget, please, remember to leave a comment. Let me know how many worms you believe we launched into this system today. And your contribution will go into the final estimate of the system's population once I do the averaging. So I definitely look forward to hearing from everyone in terms of what they think we've got here as far as worms go. Hopefully we've got more than that original estimated 673 with which the system was launched way back when, 313 days ago. With all these little babies that I see, I would have to assume that it must be. So let's let these little guys get situated and comfortable, and then we can call it a day. You might remember me mentioning how this system was fed, and that was just a moment ago. Right before I started filming, I bought food down from the freezer. Well, it was just a pear. I bought a pear down. The other stuff that I put in here was coffee. So basically the food they're getting as their first meal, that was just placed in here a short while ago, is a pear, some coffee, and then I even threw some grit in there. But as far as the worms that we just deployed into here, you got to remember that there's many places for these little guys to hide. So I'm doing my best to give you guys a good view of all of them, but I know that that's almost impossible. So that's why I figured I would just sort of unfold some of these pieces of paper that came in along with them so you could see that they're hiding here and there. And you know, before we forget, why don't I grab this coffee filter, and that's going to become our feeding zone indicator, because right there was where I placed the food. And as far as the worm count goes, let's not forget the little partition that had been set up for the horizontal migration feeding zone also has worms hanging out in it and on it. Worms definitely like to get in between the layers of corrugated cardboard like this, because I'm pretty sure that the glue that's used is something that they really enjoy eating, not to mention the cardboard itself. But I think that the glue that these pieces of cardboard are assembled with is also amongst the worms' favorites. So if you haven't factored in the worms that are right here, don't forget they're also part of the overall worm count. And let's see what else. I mean, I've got a piece of plastic that we can cover up with here. And oops, we almost forgot this little guy. He was hanging out over there by the isopods, which I'm going to take outside for sure. But I think we're at the point where we can cover up. And for now, I think those cardboards being top covering are also going to be a nice little playground for the worms to hang out in, and eventually just break down and eat. over time we'll probably just blend that stuff in to become integrated with the rest of the system, perhaps during the next check-in or first check-in with these little guys. But before we can really call it a day, there's just one more thing we've got to take care of, and a lot of you might know what that is. That's right, you guessed it. It's time to christen the system and welcome these little guys to the wormery. So please help me welcome the newest system in my wormery. When it's a system that has worms in it other than what I believe to be red wigglers, I'll usually label it as such, but the absence of any indicator to show what types of worms live in here usually by default means red wigglers, and that's what I assume we're bringing in from outside. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. My homework is getting the black soldier fly larvae outside, released into my compost barrel, cleaning up, putting away, and oh yeah, getting the bait box deployed, which is really nothing more than this thing over here. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.